On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1979, at the LaSalle County Equipment Auction in Ottawa, Illinois, a 29-year-old mechanic named Carl Degner made what everyone agreed was the dumbest purchase of the day. He paid $350 for a 1951 Diamond T-Wrecker that looked like it had been dragged out of a river. The truck sat at the far edge of the auction lot, separated from the respectable equipment the way a sick dog gets separated from the pack. The paint, what was left of it, had faded from red to a color somewhere between rust and dried blood. The tires were bald. The boom sagged. Someone had scratched the word junk into the hood with a nail, and the auctioneer hadn't bothered to disagree. The bidding started at $50. Nobody moved. "Do I hear 25? The auctioneer tried. Still nothing. Carl raised his hand. 50. The auctioneer looked surprised but recovered quickly. "I have 50. Do I hear 75? A man in the back of the crowd laughed. "That thing's not worth 50 cents. But someone else bid 75 anyway, probably just to see how high the fool in the front row would go. Carl went to 100, then 150, then 200. By the time the bidding stopped, Carl had paid $350 for a wrecker that hadn't run since 1973 and probably shouldn't have run then. "Sold," the auctioneer said, sounding almost apologetic, to the young man in the front. That's when Howard Mitchell found him. Howard Mitchell owned Mitchell's Towing and Recovery, the biggest wrecker operation in 3 counties. He ran a fleet of new Chevrolet C70 wreckers with hydraulic booms and chrome that could blind you on a sunny day. Howard made money, good money, and he had opinions about everything, especially about people who didn't know what they were doing. He walked up to Carl as Carl was counting out cash at the payment table. "Carl Degner," Howard said, his voice carried across the auction yard. "I heard you just spent $350 on that Diamond T pile of rust." "Yes, sir." Howard looked at the wrecker, then back at Carl, then started laughing. A big, theatrical laugh that made people turn and watch. "Son, that's not a wrecker. That's a death trap on wheels. The frame's probably cracked. The boom's gonna fall off the first time you lift anything heavier than a bicycle. You just threw away $350. Carl didn't say anything. "You know what you could have bought with $350? Howard continued. "A down payment on a real wrecker, something from this decade, something that actually works." "I can fix it," Carl said quietly. Howard laughed harder. "Fix it? Boy, that thing hasn't run in 6 years. The engine's probably seized. The transmission's full of water. The wiring's been chewed by rats. You'd need $1,000 in parts and 6 months just to make it a slightly nicer piece of junk." "I can fix it," Carl repeated. "No, you can't." Howard stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that was probably meant to sound fatherly but came out condescending. "Listen, I've been in the towing business for 23 years. I've seen 100 guys like you buy junk like that, thinking they're gonna restore it, make it work. You know what happens? They waste their money, waste their time, and end up selling it for scrap." He gestured toward the Diamond T. "That wrecker's not worth the steel it's made from. You just bought yourself the most expensive lesson you'll ever learn." Carl looked at Howard Mitchell, at his clean shirt, at his expensive boots, at his confident smile. Then Carl said something he'd remember for the rest of his life. "My father taught me that a machine's not dead until it stops wanting to work. And that thing," he nodded toward the Diamond T, "still wants to work. I can hear it." Howard laughed one more time, shook his head, and walked back to his spotless truck. Behind him, the auction crowd was laughing too. The young mechanic who'd paid $350 for junk. The kid who thought he knew better than Howard Mitchell. Carl didn't hear them. He was already figuring out how to get the Diamond T home. Let me tell you about Carl Degner, because understanding the man is the only way to understand what happened next. Carl was born in 1950, the son of a diesel mechanic named Frank Degner, who'd worked for International Harvester in Chicago until a layoff in 1968 sent the family looking for cheaper living. They'd ended up in Ottawa, Illinois, where Frank opened a small repair shop and taught his son everything he knew about engines, metal, and patience. Frank Degner had a rule: never throw away a machine that still has good bones. It didn't matter if the paint was gone or the engine was seized or everyone else called it junk. If the frame was solid and the casting was sound, you could build it back. Carl had grown up rebuilding engines on the floor of his father's shop. By the time he was 16, there wasn't a diesel motor he couldn't take apart and put back together. By 20, he was rebuilding transmissions that other mechanics said were trash. When Frank died of a heart attack in 1977, he left Carl the shop, a 1965 Ford Wrecker, and a toolbox that had been in the family since 1942. Carl kept the shop running. He towed cars, fixed trucks, and got by, but the '65 Ford Wrecker was getting old and parts were getting expensive. Carl needed something else, something he could afford, something he could fix himself. Then he heard about the LaSalle County auction and the Diamond T Wrecker from the old Benson Towing estate. The Diamond T Model 951 had been built in 1951 at the Diamond T factory in Chicago. It was a beast of a machine, 14,000 pounds empty, with a straight-six Hercules engine and a Holmes 440 mechanical boom that could lift 5 tons. In its day, it had been one of the best wreckers money could buy. But that day was 30 years gone. The truck had been sitting in a barn since 1973, slowly dissolving into the Illinois weather. The engine was locked up. The boom cables were frayed. The wood bed was rotted through in places. Carl spent the first week just staring at it. He'd borrowed a flatbed trailer and hauled the Diamond T to his shop. Now it sat in the back lot, looking even worse under direct sunlight than it had at the auction. His neighbor, a farmer named Ed Casper, stopped by on the third day. "Carl," Ed said, looking at the wrecker, "what the hell is that?" "It's a Diamond T. It's a pile of rust with wheels." Carl walked around the truck slowly, running his hand along the frame. "Frame's solid," he said. "No cracks. The casting on the rear end's good. The boom's straight, just needs cable and a bearing." Ed shook his head. "Howard Mitchell drove by yesterday, said you're wasting your time." "Howard Mitchell drives new trucks he bought with other people's money," Carl said. "I'm fixing this one with my own hands." For the next 6 months, Carl worked on the Diamond T every night after closing the shop. He pulled the engine, stripped it down. Found that 3 cylinders had surface rust, but nothing catastrophic. He soaked the pistons in penetrating oil for 2 weeks, then worked them free by hand. He rebuilt the carburetor, rewired the electrical system, replaced the boom cables, fabricated new bed boards from oak planks, sandblasted what rust he could, and painted over what he couldn't. By April of 1980, the Diamond T started. The sound was rough, the idle was uneven, smoke poured from the exhaust, but the engine ran. Carl drove it around the block, tested the boom, checked the brakes. Everything worked, not perfectly, but well enough. The next week, he got his first call. A farmer's truck had slid into a ditch on a gravel road 10 miles outside town. Carl fired up the Diamond T and drove out. The farmer looked at the wrecker and frowned. "That thing gonna make it?" he asked. Carl hooked up the chain, engaged the boom, and pulled the truck out in 5 minutes. The farmer paid him $20 and told everyone at the feed store that Carl Degner had the ugliest wrecker in Illinois, but it damn sure worked. Word spread slowly. Carl got more calls. Most of them were small jobs, cars in ditches, trucks stuck in mud, breakdowns on county roads, nothing glamorous, nothing that Howard Mitchell's shiny fleet would bother with. But Carl didn't mind. The Diamond T ran, and it paid for itself. Over the next 19 years, Carl Degner and his rusted Diamond T became a fixture in LaSalle County. Everyone knew the truck. Everyone had an opinion about it. Some people called it the wrecker that won't die. Others called it Degner's rust bucket. Howard Mitchell, whenever he saw it, would shake his head and mutter something about scrap value. But the Diamond T kept working. It pulled cars out of ditches in snowstorms. It hauled broken-down semis off back roads. It recovered a tractor from a creek bed, a combine from a muddy field, and once, in 1987, a delivery truck that had gone through the ice on a pond. The truck wasn't pretty. The rust got worse every year. The paint faded. The boom developed a squeak that Carl couldn't quite fix, but the frame stayed solid. The engine kept running, and Carl kept it moving. By 1998, the Diamond T had logged over 40,000 miles of recovery work and earned Carl enough money to keep his shop running through 2 recessions and 3 hard winters. Then, in September of 1998, Carl found the compartment. He was replacing a section of the cab's interior wall that had rotted out near the floor. The Diamond T's cab had always leaked, and over the years water had gotten into the wall panels and turned them to rust and mush. Carl had put off the repair for months, but finally the panel was so bad he couldn't ignore it anymore. He pulled the door trim, pried off the interior panel, and started cutting away the rusted metal. That's when he noticed something odd. The cab wall had 2 layers of sheet metal, which was normal for a 1951 truck, but between the layers there was a gap, a space that was bigger than it should be. Carl shone a flashlight into the gap. There was something inside. He cut away more of the rusted panel, working carefully now, until he could reach in and pull out what was hidden there. It was wrapped in oilcloth, heavy, stiff, darkened with age but still intact. Carl carried it to his workbench and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a leather satchel, old, cracked, the kind of thing his grandfather might have carried. Carl opened the satchel. Inside were 3 things. The first was money, old bills, bundled with rubber bands that had turned to brittle powder. He counted it 3 times, $8,200, none of the bills newer than 1950. The second was a land deed, dated 1949, for 25 acres in Grundy County, about 40 miles south. The deed was in the name of a man Carl had never heard of, Vincent Holloway. The third was a letter, handwritten on yellowed paper, dated November 1950. Carl sat down on his workbench stool and read it. Let me tell you what the letter said, because this is where everything makes sense. The letter began, "To whoever finds this, my name is Vincent Holloway. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead and you found what I hid. Let me explain." Carl kept reading. In August of 1950, I was driving this wrecker on Route 6 near Seneca when I came across an overturned truck. The driver was hurt. I pulled over to help. While I was helping him, I saw a canvas bag that had fallen from the truck's cab. The driver didn't see it. He was bleeding, confused. I got him into my wrecker and drove him to the hospital in Ottawa. The bag stayed in my truck. I should have turned it in, I know that. But when I looked inside and saw the money, over $9,000, I made a choice I'm not proud of. I kept it. I told myself I'd use it for something good. My wife was sick. The medical bills were piling up. The wrecker business was barely breaking even. I convinced myself I deserved it. But guilt ate at me. I couldn't spend the money. Every time I looked at it, I felt like a thief. So I did 2 things. First, I bought 25 acres of land near Morris, paid cash, put it in my name but never told my wife. I figured if I ever got caught, at least that land couldn't be traced to the stolen money, and maybe someday, if the guilt got too heavy, I could sell it and give the money back somehow. Second, I hid the rest of the cash in this truck, in a place nobody would ever find unless they were tearing the cab apart. I'm dying now, cancer. The doctors give me 6 months. My wife died in 1949, so she never knew. I'm leaving this wrecker to my nephew, but I doubt he'll keep it. He'll probably sell it at auction for whatever he can get. Whoever buys this truck will probably scrap it, but if someone actually fixes it, actually uses it, actually cares about it the way I did before I ruined everything, maybe they'll find this. If you do, the money's yours. The land's yours too. The deed's legal. I paid for it fair. I just ask one thing, don't think too badly of me. I made a mistake. I tried to fix it the only way I knew how. I hid the truth in a truck because I couldn't carry it anymore. Vincent Holloway, November 1950. Carl sat in his workshop for a long time after reading that letter. The next day, he drove to the Grundy County Courthouse and checked the land records. The 25 acres were still there, still in Vincent Holloway's name. No liens, no back taxes, just sitting there waiting for 48 years. Carl hired a lawyer in Morris to sort out the title transfer. It took 3 months and $800 in legal fees, but by January of 1999, the land was in Carl's name. He sold 15 of the acres to a developer for $47,000, kept the other 10 for himself. The $8,200 in cash he donated to the Ottawa Community Hospital, the same hospital where Vincent Holloway had probably taken that injured truck driver in 1950. Carl never told anyone about the letter. That was Vincent's private guilt, and it didn't need to become public shame. But the land sale changed Carl's life. He used the money to expand his shop, buy better equipment, and hire his first employee. By 2003, Degner's Towing and Recovery had 3 trucks and was competing directly with Howard Mitchell's operation. In 2007, Howard Mitchell's business went bankrupt. The economy crashed, the big contracts dried up, and Howard's expensive fleet became a liability he couldn't maintain. Carl bought 2 of Howard's trucks at auction, paid fair price, no mockery, no revenge. Howard came to Carl's shop a week later. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking at the Diamond T parked in the corner. "That thing's still running?" Howard asked. "Every day," Carl said. Howard was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. "Back in '79, I thought you were a fool." Carl shrugged. "Most people did." "But you weren't." Howard looked at the old wrecker, at the rust and the dents and the boom that squeaked. "You saw something I didn't." "I saw a machine that still wanted to work," Carl said. "That's all." Howard nodded. Then he asked the question he'd come to ask. "You hiring?" Carl thought about it, thought about 1979, thought about the laughter and the mockery and the man in expensive boots who told him he was wasting his money. Then he thought about Vincent Holloway, a man who'd made one mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to fix it. "Yeah," Carl said, "I'm hiring." Howard Mitchell worked for Degner's Towing and Recovery for 6 years, until he retired in 2013. He never laughed at the Diamond T again. Carl Degner retired in 2018 at the age of 68. He sold the business to his son, Michael, who'd grown up around the shop the same way Carl had grown up around his father's. The Diamond T is still there. It doesn't work anymore. The frame finally cracked in 2015, and Carl decided it had earned its rest. But it sits in the front of the shop now, restored as much as it can be, with a small plaque that reads, 1951 Diamond T Model 951, purchased for $350 in 1979, worked for 35 years, carried a secret for 48. Some machines are worth more than they look. Carl never put Vincent Holloway's name on the plaque. That didn't seem right. The man's guilt had been punishment enough. But sometimes, late at night when the shop's closed, Carl walks out and stands next to the old wrecker. And he thinks about the auction in 1979, about Howard Mitchell's laughter, about everyone who said he'd wasted his money. And he thinks about Vincent Holloway, a man who hid his shame in a truck that nobody wanted, trusting that someday the right person would find it. The dealer laughed at a $350 wrecker. The county called it junk. Everyone said it was worthless. They were all wrong. Not because of the money, not because of the land, but because the truck proved something that Howard Mitchell never understood. Value isn't always visible, worth isn't always loud, and the things people laugh at are sometimes the only things patient enough to wait for someone who actually cares. Carl Degner bought junk in 1979. 19 years later, that junk paid him back in ways nobody could have predicted. And somewhere in LaSalle County, in every garage and every tow yard where old wreckers sit waiting, the lesson still holds. Don't laugh too early, the machine might be listening.